So when we look at all of these different materials, solids, liquids, and gases, we can see that for all of these solids, they have some properties in common. Properties in common. And we can see that all the liquids have some properties in common, and all of these gases also have properties in common as well. So now we will look at what are the properties that each state of matter has in common. Properties of each state. All right. Now before we look at that, we're going to zoom right in to have a look at the particles. And remember, we learnt about the particle model, which means that all materials that we know are made up of particles. All materials are made of particles. And particles are really, really small objects. So small that we can't even see them. But what we have discovered is that the particles are arranged differently in each state. So the particles in a solid are different to a liquid and different to a gas. Arranged differently depending on the state. So let's look at each state and how the particles are arranged and how this affects the properties as well. So firstly, solids. For example, a piece of wood. If we could zoom in and look at the particles in wood, we would see that they are really closely packed together. All the particles that make up the wood, they're tightly packed. Tightly packed. And the particles are still moving, but they can't move very far, so they just vibrate. Back and forth and up and down. So in solids, the properties of solids, because the particles are so tightly packed, means that the solid keeps its shape. Like you can pick up a piece of wood and it holds its shape. So we say solids have a defined shape. And because the particles are tightly packed together, we can't compress or push the solid at all. So solids are incompressible. For liquids, such as some oil in a beaker, the particles are a little bit more spread out, and this time they're moving past each other. They can flow past each other. So they're closely packed together, but they're flowing around each other. Flowing particles. So when we look at a liquid overall, the properties that all liquids have is that they flow to fill up their container. Which is why you can pour a liquid into a cup or into a container. But again, the particles are still close together, so you can't compress them. You can't compress a liquid. And lastly, gases, such as helium in a balloon, if we could look at the particles of helium in a balloon, we would see that they're spread apart and they're not close to each other at all, and they're flying around really quickly inside the container, which is a balloon in this case. So the particles are far apart and they're flying around. And this means that every gas spreads out to fill the container that you put it in. Spreads out to fill the container. And because the particles are far apart, you can actually push them together. So gases are compressible.